Here we go again. When we left off, we had a camera that apparently seemed to function quite well, but when I got into some extended testing, I discovered that that was not really the case at all. And particularly at the fastest shutter speed and the smallest aperture, you could look through the back of the camera, release the shutter, and you would see the whole aperture briefly opened before the shutter functioned correctly. And that intrigued me a wee bit, and it meant that there were problems with the timing. So I had to delve into that and adjust a few things backwards and forwards. But while I was working on it and testing it and trying to get things set up, I ran into a bigger problem, and I'll show you what I mean. Now here we have a front plate from one of these cameras, and you'll see it has a little pinion up here which is driven by the cam on the front of the shaft, one of these things, and that pinion in turn drives this piece here. Well, I noticed as I was cocking the shutter there was a rough sound, a crunchy sound, and it sounded like something was skipping teeth, and that usually means that something is broken. So I pulled the camera immediately apart, checked the cocking rack, checked the cam here at both ends to make sure the teeth were present. I couldn't figure out what was going on. I'd put the front back on the camera, cock the shutter, and again you'd get that horrible skipping sound of teeth over teeth. Well, what it turned out to be was this. This little pinion is held in place on this shaft, and that shaft is just riveted into the front housing. And what had happened was that the shaft had come adrift. It's relatively, I don't think I can get it back in there easily. Let's see. No, it won't go back in for me because the end's mutilated. But basically it had backed out. And so the pinion here, which you can probably see, that's a little bit shiny and mutilated around the tips of the teeth. And so is this ring here, because that's where the skipping was happening. The action that would have transmitted through the pinion to this ring, which in turn would have cocked the shutter. Under that load, this pinion had risen slightly because the rivet had come adrift, and so the edge of the teeth were all burred off. That was an unusual one. I've never seen that before. And of course it's interesting that it spontaneously arose while I was busy working on the camera. Probably just as well, really. So there was not much for it really but to replace the whole front housing, because I didn't have much confidence that I would get this thing in there and that it would stay, since it had come loose once. So I had to put a new front on the camera. And while I was putting the front on the camera, I had to adjust the position of the main cam, where it connects to the shutter cocking rack at the back of the camera. And I had to move this basically by one tooth in order to get everything to work correctly. The problem I was having was that the rod which controls the capping plate was not free to rise up all the way. So the capping plate didn't always come up promptly and release the shutter action. And basically it turned out that the cam was about 1/2 out of position. I determined that because the action would work fine if I held the film advance firmly back against the body, which would have moved the rack in turn, of course, and of course moved that cam, and everything worked fine. But if I just cocked the shutter, just left the film advance lever to sit in its relaxed position against the body, the shutter wouldn't work. So I took a bit of tracking down. But I do have a camera that works quite well now. I have the lens focused correctly again. I put the prism back in it. I'm not out of the woods yet. So what more could possibly be wrong with this fine camera? Well, I mentioned this adjustment at the bottom. That's for adjusting the rest position of the mirror so that you can view the image and the image will be correctly focused on the focus screen up in the viewfinder. And in this case, I can't get enough adjustment. Basically, the light path there is just not correct. I can't get this to focus out to infinity correctly at all. The light path is just too long. It just won't do it. So I'm going to have to open this all up again and have a look at the little bracket that holds the mirror down in the body. And if I have a body here somewhere, I can show you what that should look like. This bracket here, it holds the mirror down in the viewing position like that. And my problem is I can't get the mirror in the correct position. I need it to be a little bit lower than it's currently held, and I just cannot get that to move down any further. So what I'm probably going to do is the little tab on the mirror tray here, I will bend that up, which will hold the mirror a little bit further down, and then I'll use my adjustment in order to get that correct for viewing. You look at the angle of this flat piece on that cam, you can see that it runs at an angle of about like that. That's a little bit steeper than I would normally see them. I would normally expect to see them somewhat flatter than that, but this certainly wants to run at an angle like that so that all the levers will drop back into position in the right spot. Is that an eccentricity of this particular component? Quite possibly. Where in the teeth of the cam or the cocking rack could certainly make a difference there in that angle that we require that to be sitting in the rest position. I'll carry on putting this front back on, we'll see what happens. So, what's the state of play with this thing? Well, I tried my best, but I cannot get a reliable camera out of this one. What do I suspect is happening? Well, we know the mirror tray is mutilated because someone's taken the corner out of it. I suspect it's slightly misshapen, and I don't think it triggers correctly. What have we got? Well, with this camera, I haven't got a shutter release in here at the moment. It'll cock. It'll fire like that correctly, about 9 times out of 10. And the other time, the shutter blades are just closed. The shutter doesn't time at all. And is it the shutter? No. This isn't even the original shutter. This is another shutter that I've serviced and put on the front of it. And another front plate, because the original was broken. And I still get exactly the same problems with this body. Now, the original shutter in a replacement front plate, I put it in another body because I'd serviced, cleaned and stripped down and serviced 3 different shells, 3 bodies. And this was body number 2. I put the shutter in this, never missed a beat. Perfect, no problems at all. And the other thing, the focus adjustment in the finder, I had absolutely no trouble getting correct focus adjustment in the finder. Whereas this one, I had to have a shim under the prism assembly, and I had to bend down slightly the tab on the mirror tray in order to pull that tray down a bit further, and I had the adjustment maxed right out. And it was only marginally good, wasn't ideal. No problems at all with this one. So there was no problem with the prism. The only thing that we can say there is there was something wrong with the mirror assembly in the original body. So what have we got here? Shutter and lens assembly from the camera we were working on. The front plate here, possibly from this body, possibly not. I can't tell, it was in pieces at the time. These are from the parts boxes. Leatherettes, again, front leatherettes, base leatherette, all came off the original camera. The camera back, this is not the original one off that camera, this is another one. Might have come with that shell, I don't know. The original leatherette looked a bit rough. The accessory shoe and the plate with the serial number from the original camera. The meter from the original camera. The rewind knob, that's come out of the parts boxes. I needed one to match the feet scale on the focus because the metric scale I had, which I was planning on using, was made for an earlier model, and the earlier model had the control knob over here and the band with the numbers on met over here, so it wasn't the same at this point if you fixed it at this point. So it's an Imperial, it's marked in feet, but not a problem. We've got a suitable rewind knob on there. But this camera, beautiful, works nice and smoothly, looks good. The top cover, that's a replacement. This one was never going to be any good. I found one of my parts boxes. It's not perfect, but it's pretty good. So I've got one nice Retina Reflex type 025, and that was the result of that little effort. Of course, you didn't get to see some of the work. And what did you not get to see? Well, I think you saw me struggle with the shutter and various other bits and pieces. But you didn't see me take the finder apart and clean it. That's a messy process. And then the final assembly, putting the meter and everything back in place. I've got another one of these. I'm going to strip it down, service it, get it back to the stage that I had this monster in the last video, and then we'll continue the assembly from there. This one. What's this one's story? Well, it needs serviced, but it works. It's all working. The shutter looks, there's oil marks on those shutter blades. That tells me that it hasn't been serviced recently and could certainly do with a service. And its other reason for being in the parts boxes amongst the casualties. Well, it's reasonably tidy. Number one, was missing the front lens element. That group was gone. Now, why it was gone, I don't know. But I did have one front lens group in my parts boxes that wasn't broken. Of course, the number doesn't match, but the image looks fine in the finder. I've got every reason to believe it'll be fine on the film. And the top cover. This has been panel beaded. This has been dropped on its head at some stage, and it's a bit wrinkly. Will I be able to find a better top cover? Well, I hope so. When I was hunting for a top cover for the other one, the first two pretty looking ones that I pulled out of the box, they were pretty alright, but they had someone's social security number scratched in the back with a blunt nail. They weren't going to be any good. So this is the one I'm going to strip down, service, get back to the stage you saw that first camera at, ready for the cleaning the finder and final assembly.